Change is hard. Change is wonderful. Change is transition and adaptation and discovery and very often compromise. Do you like those kinds of processes, or do you find them too difficult? Do you cling to old habits and resist the inevitable? As they say, whoever that they actually is, the only constant is change. And here it comes, the transition, the switch, the end of the intro. Thanks for changing the channel today to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that switches things up when it comes to a most deliciously expanding field of learning and knowing and doing. I'm your host, David Santo. This episode is about adaptability and flexibility and intentionality, whether you're in the classroom, on a farm, in a Zoom room, or at a dining room table. On today's show, we're talking about how the transition to a lower meat diet is sometimes about personal choice. Sometimes, though, it's about what's publicly offered, and sometimes what's surreptitiously allowed and or prevented. As usual, it's about systemic stuff, including grocery stores and larger global movements. And the article in focus comes from Volume 11, Issue 1 of Canadian Food Studies, published in March 2024. Opening things up with an amuse-bouche that focuses on a very specific material object, Alexia Moyer hammers me on the importance of thinking beyond tradition and habits. Actually, as usual, she is very kind and thoughtful, though she does wield a powerful tool for this segment. Then I talk with Kelsey Speakman, whose article on the financialization of flexitarianism anchors this episode in the vast gulf of food transitions. And yes, being anchored in vastness is indeed a bit of a contradiction. How very foodish of me. Then, in the aftertaste, George Brown Food Studies student Milka Milicevic gives us her multi-perspectival take on flexible fooding. Hi, Alexia.
Hey there, David.
Are you feeling flexible?
I am indeed.
Well, that's good, because this week we're talking to Kelsey Speakman about her article on the discourses of flexitarianism. Flexitarians being people who eat meat sometimes, mostly not. But the way the discourses around flexitarianism get leveraged into commercial context, into retail environments, into the public consciousness. And so there's something kind of sometimes not very flexible about flexitarianism. But discourse itself, which should be a wonderfully bendable space of imagination, can also get kind of rigid. So I don't know, you got anything we can talk about that might relate to that?
I do. I have a kitchen tool for you today.
Excellent.
One that doesn't look like it could be flexible in any way, but offers alternatives.
So non-flexible but flexible, non-discursive, say, material object.
Like a meat tenderizer.
I love it. Tell me more.
Do you have one of these in your kitchen?
No, I grew up with one, a cast aluminum meat tenderizer with two coarsenesses, one for finer grained meat and one for coarser grained meat. The meat tenderizer I have now is just a flat disc with a not very stable plastic handle. I never use it.
Really?
Actually, I use it for pressing latkes flat in the pan when I'm making them at Hanukkah, but other than that, I don't really use it.
I have the older version because it was a gift from my grandmother.
Wow, that's so satisfying. I always thought they were almost like weapons.
Yeah, for anyone who has not used a meat tenderizer or know what they look like, it looks like a hammer with teeth on a wide square head. So it's a fairly weighty object, and it's used to beat meat into submission.
to tenderize it.
To tenderize it. And as you can imagine, it makes a racket. So I've started cultivating a taste for thick cut pork chops instead of the thin. I tend to use it mainly for making pork tonkatsu.
Oh, okay. So it's really quite thin and quite tender.
Yeah. So this is a tool that breaks down the muscle fibers with the ultimate goal of making your meat easier to chew, rendering it tender. And mechanized versions of this exist such that this process may already have taken place before you bring your pork chop to your counter. But for those seeking an alternative, there are many ways to do this job without the hammer. And one is to marinate.
Oh yeah, of course.
So if you steep the meat in an acid like a vinegar or a lemon juice, or an enzymatic marinade like a yogurt-based sauce, this will do the work. The same kind of work. You could brine, you can braise. So all of these processes ultimately break down the meat structure. It's pre-digestion.
Oh, digesting meat. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
For those of you who do not wish their gifted meat mallet to go to waste, there are alternative uses for this. So should you have cashews that need breaking down into smaller pieces, it works for ice, works for peppercorns, graham crackers, or your terracotta pots if you want to use the pot shards for drainage. Now, for those of you who do not have a meat mallet but have a pork chop in need of mechanical tenderization, then you can try a rolling pin. Mm-hmm. Or a wine bottle, or, as I've discovered, a Norton anthology.
Sorry?
Yes. Well, I have 12 of these, and I'm willing to share. They have their literary and culinary uses, as well as being efficient doorstop.
Talk about a weighty tome.
Yeah. You can use your weighty tomes of 19th century British literature to whip your meat into shape. So perhaps we can use this kitchen tool as a lesson in alternatives, one that may be adapted to our changing lifestyles. But with the title of meat mallet, the meat here remains the referent. So can we move beyond this appellation, or should we? And if we do, should we simply call it the kitchen mallet for all your pulverizing meat?
I love the idea of a kitchen mallet instead of a meat mallet, because of course a lot of the meats that we buy these days are pretty soft, and we're not actually dealing with tough cuts of meats in our day-to-day cooking nearly as much as historical cooks probably did.
Yeah, and we don't do very little butchering on our own anymore. It's sort of done for us. And I'm finding it harder and harder to find whole cuts of meat.
So these specialized tools can we call it a flexitarian mallet?
Exactly.
That's maybe a little bit pushing it, but we'll see.
It's going to need to find a new use.
Wham, wham, wham. I'm going to go find my mallet and beat something up with it. Thanks for this. Kelsey Speakman is a lecturer at the University of Toronto and recently completed her PhD in Communication and Culture at York University. She is interested in multispecies interactions in consumer culture and ethical relationships involved in food provisioning and shopping. Her latest research examines how supermarkets act as mediators to hold together the infrastructures of the beef industry in Canada. As a note, the views she expresses in her article and our conversation are based on evidence from the case study she conducted, and they do not necessarily represent the perspectives or intentions of Loblaw Companies Limited. Well, Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. I'm delighted to be talking to you today about your really fascinatingly layered article, Beans, Beef, or Byproducts Following Flexitarianism's, I can't even say it, Following Flexitarians' Finances. It is a beautiful alliterative mouthful, but it is also an article that, in my reading, is about so many things. What would you say this article is about?
So I would say the article is about flexitarianism's potential to facilitate a transition toward a more sustainable and ethical food system or food systems. It uses data from a larger case study of beef shopping in supermarkets owned by Loblaw to explore what direction a transition might take when the general practice of eating less meat or eating meat only in certain contexts is turned into a defined consumer demographic that companies like Loblaw can match with new sets of products.
So flexitarianism, I remember I used to call myself a flexitarian in the early 2000s. It seemed to make sense to reduce animal-based meat consumption to a certain extent. Flexitarianism seemed to be a good option when we still wanted to eat meat sometimes. Is that sort of the way that you're interpreting flexitarianism, at least outside of the context of Loblaw?
Yes, I think in general, it describes a practice of reducing meat consumption in general. And I think that one version of that would be depending on the context. So thinking carefully about when might it be more appropriate or less appropriate to eat meat.
All of this is, as you talk about in the article, within a context of transitions away from animal-based proteins, transitions towards justice in food systems. Can you explain a little bit more about how you see flexitarianism and transitions being interlinked?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple of different ways they could be interlinked. I think in a maybe more industry context, the transition of flexitarianism is thinking about these plant-based meats as transition foods because they perhaps make the taste transition easier from eating meat to eating vegetables if you have this transitional food that tastes like meat but isn't meat. So that's sort of one version, I think, of the transition. But I think another larger transitional tool of flexitarianism, I think, could be allowing people to tune in more, again, to the context of their eating, thinking, when is it more appropriate to eat meat? When is it less appropriate to eat meat? And tuning into those kind of contextual decisions.
So in the article, you also look at how flexitarianism has kind of been leveraged as a concept by Loblaw to sell products that either contain less meat or contain no meat. So in the article, which I find fascinating, it's kind of a look behind the grocery store shelves of Loblaw in terms of its rhetoric and its marketing and its positioning of flexitarianism as a kind of device to get people to buy specific products. You talk about the framing of flexitarianism within the Loblaw context as one that's optional, versatile, and nutritious. And these are three sort of modes through which you investigate the ways that Loblaw is using flexitarianism to convince shoppers to buy stuff. So what was it in that breakdown? And maybe the broader question is, why do you find it interesting to look behind the grocery store shelves in this way? What does it reveal to us?
Well, even though right now, when we think about the context, the trendiness of plant-based meats is something that is still relevant. People are still interested in it, but it's kind of died down since that time. But I think that this kind of like fickle nature of flexitarianism as a trend actually shows something more about the larger arguments that the article is making about the ways in which this ethical potential to facilitate a long-term just transition is eroded when it's positioned as a niche market that can evaporate as the next big thing comes along. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at those patterns behind the curtains of how trends appear and dissipate in a grocery context. And I think that that serves as an example that we can learn from about how large companies are able to kind of harness the affect of a specific moment in time and direct that toward particular products or shopping behaviors that might kind of help them to diversify their portfolio and ride out whatever storm is going on.
Yeah, if I was interested in flexitarianism in the early 2000s, that sort of points to its coming and going as a theme, whether it's a trend or a discursive idea or a real practice or a transition. But that's what I love about this article is you've positioned the concept of flexitarianism within this much broader food production retail environment. And I think that's what's so compelling about this, to me anyway, is that it does permit us to see that this is a strategy of retail. This is not Loblaw contributing to social change or food systems change. And the thing that I find so interesting in the way that you've written this article, which is so layered, I mean, your writing is just beautiful, but it helps us see complex systems. And that's what you're showing with this, the ways that flexitarianism through the Loblaw's lens has potentially been anchored to homeostasis or the continuation of everything as it is. So a status quo move rather than an actual change move.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as so many of us are interested in the systemic perspective. And I find with a lot of my research, I start at one campaign or one food or one idea. And then as soon as you start scratching the surface, you pull at all these other threads that it's tangled to. Yeah, in the case of flexitarianism, I jumped in and started seeing this larger cultural context of that COVID moment element that Loblaw was working with in its advertisements for PC plant-based, this sort of larger cultural affect, this sense of simultaneously solidarity or a hope for the future, but then also underpinned by this sense of fear, whether that was fear of the virus or fear of running out of food because of the outbreak shutting down spaces like meatpacking plants, or fear of meat too because of the spaces that may have been the sources of the virus. So I think we kind of notice those patterns repeating even now in the context of the trade war with the US. There's a similar mix of solidarity and fear that in current Loblaw campaigns we see being directed toward the promotion of Canadian products.
Another perhaps only temporal move on Loblaw's part.
Yeah.
I love also how you reference back to some of the early, like the 1980s messaging and promotional material that Loblaw put out through the Insider's Report, which was an incredible, rich, complicated culture-making device that positioned President's Choice, for example, as this huge, important, trendy, popular brand. And Loblaw continues to ride on that, even though the age of Dave Nichol has passed. We still have his heritage in the ways that Loblaw influences and informs Canadian food culture. It's very powerful. What else are you working on now? And does it follow some of these threads, or are there new research directions that you're going in?
Yes, it certainly takes up some of this. I think one thing that developed out of this article was that citizen consumer investor framework, and that ended up being a central theoretical part of one of my dissertation chapters. I was looking at supermarkets as mediators in my dissertation, which I'm still interested in various ways. And in that chapter, I was looking at supermarkets as kind of like insurance brokers, that mediating sense, in terms of how they act to offer to shoppers as these sort of citizen consumer investors this selection of premium products like PC plant-based, from which people can choose to insure themselves against future food system risks by investing in this sustainable future. So I was working with that citizen consumer framework that a lot of folks have talked about, where people are encouraged to position themselves as consumers more than citizens to vote for the kinds of futures they want. So I was thinking about how investing has kind of become tacked onto that identity, as you're encouraged to invest in the kind of future that you want.
Very interesting. A whole new take on that longer school of thought around what we are as humans on this planet. Well, it's fascinating work, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to talk to us about it. I hope it will inspire others to look behind the grocery store shelves, or to think a little bit more critically about what they're doing when they stick something in their mouth.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for continuing this conversation in various other kinds of formats.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Milka Milicevic is transitioning into her fourth year in the Honors Bachelor of Food Studies program at George Brown College in Toronto. With previous professional experience in nutrition and market research, she brings a lot of insights to her take on Kelsey's article, and to what she perceives about companies like Loblaw when they try to promote a given food practice. She also makes a very compelling argument to follow in her footsteps in the Food Studies BA. George Brown Marketing Department, listen up. And full disclosure, I also teach in that program and echo her sentiments.
My name is Milka Milicevic, and I'm a student heading into my final year of the Honors Bachelor of Food Studies program at George Brown College in Toronto. Before that, I worked as a market researcher in the corporate sector, where I led projects for some very large food businesses. I also have a background as a registered holistic nutritionist, which is why I was interested in reading Kelsey Speakman's article, Beef, Beans, or Byproducts, Following Flexitarianism's Finances. I have an academic interest in corporate power dynamics in food systems, and I've done several projects specifically on corporate concentration in the grocery retail sector in Canada. But I was also drawn to it on a personal level because over time, I have transitioned myself and my family to what I describe as a plant-forward flexitarian way of eating. I was curious to learn what Speakman's research found about flexitarianism and how it's being co-opted by large corporations as a way to insulate their financial portfolios. Before I dive into the article, I want to take a quick moment to give a short plug to the Honors Bachelor of Food Studies program at George Brown. It's a really comprehensive program where we learn to critically examine food systems while at the same time explore them in ways that help us also gain a deeper understanding of major societal, health, and environmental issues. What makes this bachelor's program extra special is that we get to apply the theory we learned directly in our hands-on culinary arts labs. Plus, many of the food studies courses give us opportunities to practice being actionists, working together to create real positive change in food systems. It's been such a valuable and enjoyable experience for me. So if you're thinking about making a career pivot and want to build a meaningful food-focused career, I definitely recommend it. All right, now on to Speakman's article. For some time, I've been thinking about the protein transition in food systems discussed in the article. I had hoped that flexitarianism might be one such promising path toward a just transition away from the unsustainable intensive animal production practices that dominate food systems in Canada and elsewhere. But this article made me pause and reassess my thinking on that because it clearly shows that implementing a just protein transition won't be easy, especially with powerful players like Loblaw who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. At the same time, they're creating the illusion that they're at the forefront of change because they keep up with and even shape so-called trends like flexitarianism. Loblaw's flavor of flexitarianism, as Speakman puts it, definitely dulls the concept's potential to disrupt the current system. It reduces flexitarianism to just a new consumer demographic, a group to whom Loblaw can market an expanding range of their PC plant-based products. Meanwhile, animal-derived foods continue to be framed as the default or the real thing. That also allows Loblaw to avoid causing any friction in their relationship with their primary supplier of beef, Cargill, who is also incidentally getting into the alternative protein space as the article notes. What struck me the most, though, and the main argument Speakman makes, is that Loblaw is jumping on the flexitarian trend mostly to protect its financial interests. They're looking to future-proof their infrastructure and investments against the growing risks of intensive animal agriculture, but without making any real structural changes to that sector. This example really brings to life what a financialized food system looks like. So to wrap up, this article demonstrates how a potentially transformational concept like flexitarianism is still vulnerable to being co-opted by groups driven mainly by financial motives. As Speakman points out, the big question is whether flexitarianism is flexible enough to handle all the different interpretations being attached to it, and yet stay grounded in a solid foundation that supports and maybe even strengthens diverse and sustainable food networks. Overall, this article is an excellent source for readers interested in seeing how powerful actors in food systems will go to great lengths to protect the status quo.
And so another episode ends, or merely transitions into the flexible ether of the podcast verse. Matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed, just like digital sound waves and certain sentiments about food. So if you feel your energies for flexitarianism being transformed, get in touch with us and tell us how the evolution of food is affecting you. As our guest today expressed in so many different ways, there's plenty of space for both change and stasis, for flexible adaptation and thoughtful resistance. Though it may sometimes seem like our food institutions are omnipotent, we all hold lots of power. Thank you very much to today's guests, Alexia Moyer, Kelsey Speakman, and Milka Milicevic. Our executive producers are Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett. I'm David Santo. If you haven't already liked or rated or commented on the show, please spend a few seconds to do so. It really makes a difference. Check the show notes for links mentioned on today's episode and become part of the conversation on social media or by contributing to Canadian Food Studies. There are flexible options for everyone. Finally, this. Once upon a time, back in 1952, Frederick Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth wrote a science fiction novel called The Space Merchants. In it, they presaged a planet Earth that was dominated by advertising companies, overpopulated and overexploited, and underfed to the point that colonies on Mars had been established for producing edible algae in vertical farms powered by slave labor. Wow. The kicker is, the algae also went into feeding a lab-grown biomass of poultry meat called Chicken Little. Yep. Cell-cultured meat alternatives already being critiqued nearly 75 years ago.